Silence speaks louder than words, and gestures reveal secrets that the lips dare not utter. In a world where love is often mistaken for explicit declarations and romantic promises, there exists a deeper, more enigmatic layer of human emotion, one that dwells in the unconscious. When he does not say "I love you," but something in his eyes, his actions, and his presence screams it in silence, we are faced with a mystery that ordinary language cannot reach. This is where Jungian psychology comes in, offering keys to decipher the hidden symbols of affection, the archetypes that shape our relationships, and the projections that connect us to one another. Prepare yourself to dive into a deeper understanding of love that goes beyond words. Leave in the comments, "I recognize love even when it is silent." Carl Jung teaches us that the language of the unconscious manifests through symbols, dreams, and subtle behaviors. Love, when unspoken, often expresses itself through symbolic channels, gestures, attitudes, glances, and even silences. Understanding whether someone loves you, even if they do not verbalize it, requires sensitivity to perceive these signs and a deeper knowledge of the human psyche. One of Jung's fundamental concepts is projection, in which we attribute to others what is unconscious within ourselves. Often we expect the other person to express love the way we would like, without realizing that they do it in their own way, shaped by their shadow and personal history. When we understand this, we stop demanding and start observing. Another important concept is the shadow, the repressed part of the personality. Someone may love intensely, but have difficulty expressing that love due to fear, trauma, or unconscious conditioning. The difficulty in saying "I love you" can reflect internal conflicts, not the absence of feelings. Integrating this shadow is part of the process of individuation, the path toward the wholeness of the self. In a relationship, integrating the animus and anima archetypes is also essential. A man who loves but does not say so may be in the process of integrating his feminine side, the part that nurtures, feels, and expresses emotions. He loves, but he is still learning to recognize and deal with this internal energy. Thus, from a Jungian perspective, loving in silence is not the absence of love, but an invitation to decipher the soul's subtlest symbols. Love lived at this level is profound, archetypal, and transformative. Love that is not spoken often proves truer and deeper than love draped in easy promises. Jung invites us to realize that the most intense feelings usually do not manifest directly, but through symbols, gestures, and behaviors that escape ordinary language. In this context, recognizing a man's love when he does not verbalize it is an exercise in deep listening to the soul and sensitivity to the unconscious signs that emerge between the lines of everyday life. Jung believed that the unconscious is structured in symbols and archetypes. This means that every human behavior carries meanings beyond the obvious. When someone loves but does not say it, love can emerge through small acts of care, consistent presence, silent protection, effort to be together even in difficult moments. The psyche manifests itself in these attitudes as a form of archetypal expression, revealing true feelings through a symbolic language. For example, when he worries about your physical and emotional well-being without verbalizing affection, when he remembers seemingly irrelevant details about you, when, without speaking of feelings, he acts to make your life easier. These are all unconscious communications of affection. These are signs of an emotional investment often beyond the conscious capacity for expression. He may not say "I love you," but he demonstrates that love through actions that embody commitment, loyalty, and presence. Many men have been raised in a culture that associates emotional expression with fragility, loss of control, or even weakness. Therefore, the masculine unconscious often protects itself through silence or indirect expressions. Jung would call this an adaptation of the ego to cultural demands, which can suffocate conscious access to emotion, but does not eliminate its existence in the unconscious. Thus, loving energy, though repressed in language, escapes through symbolic behavior. It is also important to observe the moments when a man enters crisis, inner conflict, or even emotional withdrawal. Often, this indicates that love is pressing against the personality structure, demanding a movement of transformation. Jung speaks of this process as a tension between the ego and the unconscious, a moment that precedes individuation. When a man feels deep love but still cannot name it, he experiences this tension as a kind of symbolic crossing. Love transforms him, even if he resists. Observing this process with patience and empathy is essential. Instead of demanding declarations, we can learn to interpret the signs. This does not mean accepting cold or distant relationships, but understanding that emotional communication has its own maturation journey. Jung teaches us that every human being is a universe in development, and authentic feelings require time to emerge fully into consciousness. Moreover, when there is genuine emotional attunement, the symbolic language becomes even richer. A gaze that lingers longer than usual, a subtle change in tone of voice when he speaks to you, a repeated gesture that happens only when you are together. These are unconscious codes that reveal deep emotional bonds. At this level, the loving relationship becomes a silent dance of meanings that only someone attentive to the soul can perceive. The challenge, then, is not to force the other to say he loves you, but to develop the sensitivity to recognize when love is already present. This recognition is a form of mature love that respects the other's psychic timing and values the symbols that arise from the soul. When we look through this lens, silence can be as revealing as words, and a gesture more eloquent than any speech. Carl Jung offers us one of the most revealing keys to understand why so many men have difficulty expressing loving feelings: the concept of the shadow. The shadow is composed of everything that has been repressed, denied, or not integrated into consciousness. In many men, especially those raised under traditional models of masculinity, feelings were cast into the shadow as weaknesses to be avoided. The result is an emotional blockage that prevents verbalization of affection, even though the feeling is there, alive and beating in the unconscious. From an early age, society demands of men hardness, control, and rationality. Crying, displaying vulnerability, or saying "I love you" are seen as signs of weakness. To survive this cultural model, the man learns to hide his emotional side. Jung understands this process as an adaptation of the ego to external demands, but at a high cost internal division. Love in this context does not disappear but is pushed to the margins of consciousness, becoming something the man feels but cannot translate into words. When a man loves and does not say so, he may be facing a confrontation with his own shadow. This confrontation is not always conscious. He may feel a desire to open up, to confess what he feels, but something blocks him: a fear, a shame, a discomfort he himself does not understand. This happens because the shadow does not manifest directly. It presents itself as resistance, irritation, withdrawal, or even distance. Paradoxically, this distancing can be a defense against the intensity of his own feeling. A woman who perceives this movement can easily interpret it as disinterest. But from a Jungian perspective, emotional withdrawal does not always mean an absence of love. Often it means that love has touched an unconscious wound, awakening archetypal memories of abandonment, humiliation, or rejection that the man does not yet know how to process. Thus, he retreats not because he does not feel, but because he feels too much. The masculine shadow also carries the archetype of the wounded warrior. He learned to fight, to conquer, to protect, but not to feel. The heart that loves is seen as an emotional battlefield through which he does not know how to pass. This explains why many men prefer to demonstrate love through practical actions, such as helping, fixing, providing, or simply being by your side in silence. They love within the limits that their own shadow allows. The process of individuation proposed by Jung is the path by which a man can integrate this rejected part of himself. This requires courage to look inward, confront the painful contents of the shadow, and allow feeling to become conscious. This process is long and often happens gradually within the loving relationship, as long as there is space for silence and understanding. In this scenario, the woman can play a fundamental role, not by demanding that he say what he feels, but by creating a safe space where emotional expression can emerge. Empathic listening, non-judgment, and recognition of small signs are ways to facilitate this process. Mature love understands that silence can be a disguise of the shadow, but also a bridge to transformation. It is important to remember that the shadow is not only negative. Within it also resides unrealized potential, repressed gifts, and intense emotions. When a man integrates his shadow, he becomes more whole, and in this process, love that was once only act, gesture, or presence also begins to transform into words, vulnerability, and true emotional surrender. Therefore, recognizing men's difficulty in expressing feelings is not about accepting less, but about understanding more deeply what lies behind the silence. When you understand that he is fighting with his own shadow, you can see silence as a space in transformation, where love is trying to find a way to emerge. Analytical psychology, according to Carl Jung, presents a profound and symbolic vision of the internal polarities that inhabit every human being. In every woman there is an unconscious masculine component called the animus, and in every man, an unconscious feminine component called the anima. These archetypes are fundamental for understanding the dynamics of loving relationships and, above all, the conflicts around the expression of feelings. When a man loves but does not say so, the state of his relationship with his own anima may be the key to understanding this emotional resistance. The anima represents in the male psyche the bridge to the world of emotions, intuition, receptivity, and affective expression. If it is repressed or poorly developed, the man will have difficulty accessing his sensitivity consciously. This does not mean that he does not feel, but that he does not know how to articulate what he feels, because the internal pathway that would enable this movement is blocked, fragmented, or distorted. This difficulty often appears in relationships. A man may love deeply but feel paralyzed when expected to verbalize that love. He may even become irritated by demands for words of affection, not out of lack of love, but because he is disconnected from his anima function. Jung understood that without the development of the anima, a man remains emotionally immature, reacting defensively whenever he is called to dive into the symbolic and sensitive universe of affection. On the other hand, it is through relationships that this function can be awakened and integrated. The woman, by externally symbolizing the man's anima, plays a powerful but also challenging role. When she acts with empathy, patience, and loving firmness, she activates that inner dimension in him, functioning as a mirror and catalyst for transformation. However, if she demands, criticizes, or forces, she may trigger defensive reactions that further reinforce emotional distancing. It is essential to understand that the process of integrating the anima is slow and often painful for the man. He needs to learn to feel, to name emotions, to become vulnerable, skills that in general were not valued in his upbringing. Jung describes this process as an encounter with the unconscious, a crossing that, when welcomed, leads to significant affective maturation. A man who integrates his anima becomes more sensitive, more empathetic, and more capable of consciously expressing what he feels. On the other side of the equation, the woman also projects her animus, her inner masculine aspect, onto the men she relates to. When the animus is unconscious or distorted, she tends to expect the man to be absolutely rational, direct, verbal, and confident. If he does not respond in this way, she may feel frustrated, as if his love were insufficient or inconsistent. However, this expectation often fails to consider the difference between love that is felt and love that is spoken. The integration of the animus in a woman allows her to develop discernment, inner strength, and clarity, while also learning to recognize and respect the other's limits. By balancing this internal energy, she becomes less reactive and more open to love's symbolic language. She understands that a feeling does not need to fit into a rational mold to be true, and that silence can contain more truth than a forced speech. Therefore, the dance between anima and animus within each individual directly influences the quality of the loving relationship. When both partners begin a process of self-knowledge and integration of these internal polarities, the noise in emotional communication diminishes. The man starts to connect with his sensitivity without fear of losing his identity, and the woman begins to perceive that love does not need to follow a fixed script to be legitimate. Mature love is born from the integration of these opposites. It does not demand daily declarations, but rather presence, listening, and mutual recognition. When a man finds his anima, he learns to say, "I love you," not only with words, but with his soul. And when a woman finds her animus, she learns to trust the gestures and silence that also speak of love. The individuation process, according to Carl Jung, is the path by which the individual becomes who they really are, integrating all aspects of their psyche, including those that were rejected, forgotten, or repressed. It is a movement of reconciliation between conscious and unconscious, which leads the human being toward inner wholeness. This process does not happen in isolation. It is profoundly influenced by intimate relationships, especially by loving bonds. When a man loves in silence, unable to verbalize what he feels, and the woman seeks to understand rather than demand, a fertile space for shared individuation opens, a type of emotional and spiritual growth that transforms both. In a loving relationship, each partner mirrors parts of themselves in the other that they have yet to recognize. Love is not just attraction or affinity, it is also a psychic field where projections, shadows, and archetypes meet. When he does not say "I love you" but remains present, involved and caring, he is offering his partner a mirror of her own emotional needs, her need for confirmation, her own difficulty in trusting love without direct evidence. At the same time, he faces the challenge of accessing his anima, his denied sensitivity and vulnerability. This scenario, rather than representing a limitation, can be the starting point for a transformative journey. Shared individuation happens when, instead of trying to change the other, each one looks inward and asks, "What is this relationship revealing about myself? Which parts of me are being activated, disturbed, or illuminated?" This internal movement is what leads to real maturation. It does not demand perfect declarations or idealized behaviors, but rather the courage to know oneself through coexistence with the other. When there is emotional silence, there is also an opportunity for deep listening. His silence can teach her to trust her intuition, to perceive the language of the body, patterns of behavior, moments of intense presence, and her discomfort in the face of this silence can teach him to make room to feel, to listen to his own emotions, and gradually allow love to find its voice. In this subtle exchange, both grow. The relationship ceases to be a stage for romantic performances and becomes a laboratory of inner transformation. However, this journey is not simple. It requires patience, a willingness for symbolic dialogue, and above all, a commitment to one's own evolution. Jung affirms that meeting the other is always a meeting with oneself. The partner is not there to fill gaps, but to illuminate unconscious aspects that still need integration. When he loves but does not say so, perhaps he is unconsciously asking her to learn to trust what is not spoken. When she demands and becomes frustrated, perhaps she is being called to develop her own inner strength and effective autonomy. Shared individuation does not demand perfection, but presence. It is a process that embraces limitations, understands silences, and sees in the contained gesture a legitimate attempt to love, even if incomplete. It is in this space that the relationship transforms into a spiritual path, a sacred space where love does not need to be shouted to be real. On the contrary, the deeper it is, the more silent it becomes. By recognizing that the other is also in a process just as you are, a new way of relating is born, a more mature, less reactive, and more compassionate form. It is not necessary for him to say, "I love you" every day. What matters is that both are willing to grow together, to welcome the human in the other, to recognize the soul's symbols in everyday life. On this path, love reveals itself not as a verbal certainty, but as a constant presence, a silent force that transforms, integrates, and awakens. And it is in this deep, symbolic love that shared individuation is realized, not as a destination, but as a continuous process of mutual self-knowledge. To love is above all a process of discovery, of the other, but also of oneself. When he does not say "I love you" but acts with care, presence, and respect, perhaps he is offering a form of love that escapes the logic of words, but resonates in the silent language of the soul. Carl Jung teaches us that the most profound feelings often hide beneath layers of shadow, fear, and conditioning. Recognizing them demands more than listening. It demands inner vision. Throughout this journey, we learn that the absence of declarations is not the absence of love, but an invitation to symbolic perception, careful reading of gestures, and welcoming the other as a being in transformation. Shared individuation builds itself in this space when there is surrender despite silence, when there is trust in what is not spoken but felt deeply. If you feel that this content has helped you see love from a new perspective, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. And before you go, watch the video on the screen. It may reveal even more about the heart's hidden language, because love, when true, always finds a way to be recognized.